there is a bit of a misnomer that the British unified India administratively. Not really. India was ruled by one king, Ashoka, about 3 centuries before Christ. And he ruled an empire which would be about 3 times the size of whatever the East India Company and subsequently the British ruled across India. And here again, we have this tendency to look at British presence in India as an unbroken line. It isn't really. The first part is a company, a corporation out for profit, which rules a country. It's the second part, after 1857 to 1947, is what we would correctly call the Raj, where India enters into a direct relationship with the crown. Now, if you look at the map, which is up on the screen today, at the moment, this is the Mughal Empire, the greatest extension of the Mughal Empire, and it covers practically all of India and the Indian subcontinent, including Afghanistan, almost all of Pakistan, all of Bangladesh, parts of Burma, and goes deep down into the southern part of India. This is under the Emperor Aurangzeb. The northern part of India had a huge civilization about 3,000 years before the start of the Common Era, what we call the Harappan Valley Civilization or the Indus Valley Civilization. It was a civilization that was based around valley floors and covered a very substantial part of northern India, even moving a little bit towards the southern part of India. But this was a civilization, again, lost to history. It's the building of the Indian railways that started revealing these, when the deep digging started taking place, that started revealing these large amounts of brick which started emerging in the diggings. Suddenly everything was stopped and the Archaeological Survey of India stepped in. That is when they discovered two of these big cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. We do not know what the original names of the cities were. The word Mohenjo-daro means mound of the dead, and Harappa was a small village close to that area. In these cities are granaries, citadels, drainage systems, a primitive form of a WC. There are ports which go down into the eastern seaboard of India. Now, at roughly about 2,000 years before the Common Era, we find the civilization dying out. The early belief was that the Aryan people, which thanks to Hitler ended up getting a rather bad name, but they were simply a racial group out of Asia Minor. One group moved west and became the ancestors of much of today's Germanic people. One branch moved south and east and became the ancestors of much of today's Persian and North Indian people. In fact, the group of languages is also the same, and it's collectively referred to as the Indo-Germanic or the Indo-European group of languages. So German and the ancient Indian language of Sanskrit have the same root. Now, it was felt that with the Aryans moving into India through the two northern passes, the Bolan Pass and the Khyber Pass, that they invaded India and displaced the civilization. Today, fresh excavations have tell us that this civilization, the Harappan Valley civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, was already in a decline. It was dying due to natural causes. Climate change has always been with us, and it was year after year of drought, the rivers drying up and changing course, which was gradually ending this civilization. This is then supplanted by the Aryan people who bring much of the primitive form of Hinduism, which we see even in India today. Now, through these two passes, the Khyber and especially, and to a smaller extent, the Bolan, most of these invasions start coming into India through the northwest. The Huns, the Kushans, the Afghans, the Mongols, the Huns, wave after wave of invasion starts coming into India. The interesting thing is that almost all these invaders made India their home, and the Mughals which is a distortion of the word Mongol, were the ones who really established a vast empire across India. The Emperor Akbar was a contemporary of Elizabeth I, and he had an income estimated to be between 30 to 35 times the size of what Elizabeth I had. Today, we also know that at that point of time, in the world's GDP, all of Western Europe had a GDP of roughly 30%, India had a GDP of roughly 30%, and China had a GDP of roughly 30%. Again, in Western Europe, it's that point of time when Britain, France, and Germany are not the wealthy countries. It is Spain and Portugal which have the money and which gradually starts changing. Another interesting thing that comes out is that all the people who came to India settled down in India. Every invader who came by sea, the Dutch, the French, the British, they all left. One can't really put one's finger onto why exactly it happened, but it did happen. And the traces they left behind are gradually just being flattening out and are being absorbed with the greater India, if you will, because India has had this enormous capacity to simply keep absorbing. This is also its cross, it's also its greatest strength. It's the world's oldest unbroken civilization, going back almost 5,000 years. Now, when the East India Company, somewhere along the line, it started almost imperceptibly merging with the crown, and the interests of the crown and the East India Company became almost inseparable. Now, when the early men, the Messrs. Hawking and Roe, arrived in the court of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, they were welcomed. They came with gifts, they came with new ideas, they were welcomed, and they were given a small trading post. This is, of course, a Dutch trading post. They set up these, what were called factories. These factories didn't manufacture anything, but were located on the periphery of India's coastline. And these were fortified little establishments where the traders lived, where they traded, and from where they sent out their goods. Starting from tiny little settlements, the great cities, the great coastal cities of Mumbai, earlier Bombay, Chennai, earlier Madras, Kolkata, earlier Calcutta, began settling down. Within a few decades of the East India Company arriving in India, the immensely powerful Mughal Empire had started disintegrating. Fratricide, patricide, you name it, it was all happening. There was one very basic reason for that. The Mughals had no system of primogeniture. It was not necessarily the eldest son who would come to the throne. Theoretically, it was meant to be that the most capable son would come to the throne, but in practice, it rarely worked because every brother thought he was more capable than the next. The result was numerous civil wars started taking place right across the Mughal Empire. For example, the Emperor Aurangzeb, who I mentioned a few moments ago, when the Indian Empire under the Mughals reached its largest territorial expansion, he killed 3 of his brothers and one, Dara Shikoh. He dragged him through the streets of Delhi till he died. Now, as a result of that, Aurangzeb is the last great king, so to say, of the Mughal lineage. After that, the empire just starts fragmenting. The governors start becoming more powerful than the king himself. Tiny little empires or tiny little kingdoms start becoming larger and larger. In the central part of the map in front of you, the Marathas start expanding. They are become a direct threat to the Mughal Empire. They go through Delhi. The Mughal king becomes a pensioner of the Marathas, of the Maratha Empire. And the East India Company really settled in only after what were called the Maratha Wars. The first and the second Maratha Wars ended, is when some sort of stability came for the East India Company. Now, here is where the company starts finding a remarkable opportunity for itself. It starts interfering, if you will, or moving into the ways of, into the country. It starts helping somebody, supplies arms to somebody else, disintegrates another little thing, all for the same simple reason of gradually expanding. It was Clive, Robert Clive, who for some strange reason used to be referred to as Clive of India in the early history books. It was the defeat of the French in the battle, the battle against Dupleix in the southern part of India. And secondly, the Battle of Plassey, which brings the East India Company to the fore and makes it almost like a controlling force across India. It was Dupleix whom he defeated, because the French were also expanding very rapidly in the southern part of India. And there were 5 major establishments which had been set up by the French in different parts of India. It's only after the defeat of Napoleon that the French were confined to those 5 establishments. Like, for example, one of these is fairly well known even today, the town of Puducherry, or Pondicherry as it was earlier called. And the streets are still Rue so-and-so, and till very recently, the police even wore képés. But the big change comes after the Battle of Buxar in 1765. The beleaguered Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II signs away his independence in turn for security to Robert Clive. Clive receives the right to collect the Diwani of Bengal, or the right to collect taxes in the Greater Bengal area, which is more or less the eastern part of India. Now, the big shift starts taking place for the company. It is taxes and not trade that become the main course, that become the main source of money for the East India Company. To give you an idea of the kind of money which was being generated, Clive went back to England with £1 million for the king and £250,000 for himself. He expected a grand welcome and a great welcome when he returned to England. That welcome was not forthcoming. Everybody was happy to take his money, but after the great recognition Clive expected, it really wasn't there. And the man, he finally committed suicide by slitting his own throat. The other thing which happened was, at this point of time, within the East India Company, with this newfound wealth which was being generated in India, like, for example, with the Governor General Warren Hastings, who was a trial of impeachment took place in Parliament against him. The reformer Edmund Burke referred to the East India Company as this evil pestilence on the face of our planet. With this newfound money which started coming in, the nabobs, as they ended up being called, moved out of India with immense fortunes. Of the many words that have gone from India to the English language, one of the first words to go was the word loot. This is what these men had come to do. It was said that these young men come to shake the pagoda tree. The pagoda was a small gold coin, and they returned with these immense fortunes. Whenever Parliament tried to clip the wings of this increasingly powerful company, all those measures came to naught, for one simple reason, that the Crown and an overwhelming number of parliamentarians had an interest in the company. With the newfound money which these men made in India, they returned to Britain and steadily started purchasing the rotten boroughs. Those rotten boroughs gave them a platform to move into Parliament. This is, of course, a caricature of Clive with all the money which he's made in India and which he's brought back. To give you an example of how the system, if you could like to, if you can, one could call it a system, worked. Thomas Pitt came to India as the governor of Madras, made an immense fortune for himself, including the Pitt diamond, which is now a part of the French crown jewels, which he carried back and was able to sell for a substantial price. He was the not too distant ancestor of William Pitt the Elder and William Pitt the Younger. And William Pitt the Younger, along with Arthur, is it Arthur or is it Richard, with one of the Wellesley brothers, one was the general and the other was the Governor General of India. They were the ones who aggressively moved into the expansion of British rule in India. And this is straight after the end of the loss of the American colonies. But if we take our judgments and our hindsight and our holier than thou attitude of today and just put it aside for a moment, there has perhaps been no company, no corporation more successful before and since as the East India Company. At no point of time did it employ more than 40 people in its offices in London. It was 40 people who were running a country, an army, and an administrative service of roughly about 100,000 men in India. It was an extraordinarily efficient and, if you will, a fairly ruthless machine which was targeted to one thing: profit. One of those things which generated a very substantial amount of money for India, for Britain, was opium. As the Chinese historian Wan Chung said, very simplistically, though I may say, that Britain got tea, China got opium, India got colonialism. It was the sale of Indian opium to China which generated much of the bullion which paid for several wars which were taking place across Europe. One war which was almost entirely funded by the opium trade was the second phase of the Napoleonic Wars across across Europe. This was an opium factory, and this was an opium stacking house. And when the opium fleet would sail down the river Hooghly, heading to the boats, to the ships in the harbor of Calcutta, it would be preceded by gunboats and by drummer boats, clear the way the opium fleet is sailing down. Now this is how the map starts shaping up, and the greater consolidation starts taking place of the British within India. The last 2 or 3 major states, independent states of India, the Kingdom of Awadh, with its capital at Lucknow that lay east of the capital of Delhi, and the last great independent Indian state, the Punjab, were absorbed by Lord Dalhousie. Lord Dalhousie, if you would like to use that pronunciation. Lord Dalhousie is often remembered in India for precipitating the great uprising of 1857, or the Mutiny as it was referred to earlier, and as some historians of today prefer to call it, the First War of Indian Independence, which I think has more of patriotism than historical sense. Dalhousie passed these 2 laws, which was one, what he called the doctrine of lapse, and the second, what he called the principles of misgovernance. Under the doctrine of lapse, an Indian princely state, which did not have a natural heir, would lapse to the paramount power, being the East India Company. Under the doctrine of, under the principles of misgovernance, the Governor General in council could decide that a particular princely state is misgoverned and take it over, as happened with the state of Awadh and with the state of Jhansi. What we do not really remember Dalhousie for is, in today's terms, we would perhaps call him a communications man. The railway system, the postal system, the telegraph system were all started by this man. This is the last great Indian emperor, Ranjit Singh, whose son, Dalip Singh, finally died in England and was persuaded to gift the Kohinoor diamond to Queen Victoria. This was the last emperor of Awadh, whose interest was more in pigeons, in chess, and in poetry than in governing. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was exiled and sent to Rangoon, where he died. And there is a little poignancy in the on the lines on his grave, which is there. How unfortunate is Zafar that he could not even get 2 yards in the land of his beloved. Now, when we come to the great uprising of 1857, this is what the map of India looks like. The pinkish areas are the British controlled territories. The yellowish areas are the ones which are closer allies of the British. The Nizam of Hyderabad, or the Nizam as is pronounced in Britain, the world's richest man, controlled an area roughly about the size of England and Wales. And he was the Nizam. He was a prime minister. He was a vice, not a prime minister, like he was sent down to the south as a viceroy by the Mughal emperors and ended up becoming more powerful than the king himself. At the Great Uprising, it is the Great Uprising of 1857, which is a major turning point of this period in Indian history, where the sepoys or soldiers of the Indian army rise up in rebellion against the British officers. In areas, it had widespread public support. In other areas, it had none. These are the remains of the Lucknow Residency, which went through this enormous siege. And this was the only place in the world where the Union Jack was never lowered. It flew 24 hours a day, 24 hours, not day, but 24 hours through the day and through the night as a mark of tribute to the men who died here. This also led to a major looting spree right across that. The world's largest palace complex, the Kaiser Bagh of Lucknow, was completely demolished, which was larger than Versailles. And then Versailles, of course, took over as the largest palace complex. This is Lady Canning, the wife of the Viceroy, Lord Canning, who was the Viceroy at the time of the Great Uprising and who tried to placate and try to smoothen all the troubled waters after the Great Uprising. And this is now the Queen's Proclamation of November 1857, which takes place in Calcutta, where the Queen, where now the powers of the East India Company are abrogated and transferred to the Crown, which functions through a Secretary of State for India. And this is now the period, correctly speaking, if we were to use the word Raj, this is the period of the Raj. The Queen Victoria, in 1877, then takes on the title of Empress of India, and the title continues till India's independence, when King George is referred to as the King Emperor of India. Queen Victoria is, of course, her great love of India, though having never set foot on the country. And this relationship with Abdul Karim has been the subject of much speculation in recent times, but there seems to be very little in terms of, except for some sort of salacious gossip, there's nothing very much to it, except that she learned certain Indian ways and languages from him. Now we come to look at the map of the British Empire, high noon of empire, the closing years of the 19th century. If we were to really go back several centuries, the first millennium of the Common Era really belonged to the East. All the great civilizations lay east of what is today's Suez. You could even include Egypt in that, Mesopotamia, China, India, Japan. As one historian put it, a little crudely, I think, but perhaps a little, and also with a level of exaggeration. He said that there were great cities in the East when Europe had barely stopped swinging from the trees. Well, that's really stretching it. But all the great civilizations were towards the East. Rome also became wealthy only after it had captured Egypt, and the wealth from Egypt started flowing towards Rome. All that starts changing after the two great voyages. Vasco da Gama finding the sea route to India, Christopher Columbus starts finding the New World. Now the focus shifts to Europe, and the 19th century quite literally belongs to England and to Britain. But of the colonies, which are there on the map in pink, the people who went out from Britain to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, ended up becoming Canadians or Australians or New Zealanders. The ones who came to India never became Indians. And in this, the perception of Britain in its own perception of the world is also remarkable. This map perhaps shows that in so many ways. It's not the map, it's the border. Assorted natives in various shades of dress and undress, Britannia sitting astride the globe, Neptune holding it up, and the three words on top, freedom, federation, not really. For the colonies, these were not really words that operated. In later years, it was the Indian nationalists who used these very words that we find freedom, we find justice, we find law in Britain. Where is it in the colonies? Both two major freedom fighters of India, Pandit Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Gandhi, were both educated in England. As we move on through the years and come into the 20th century, this is what the map of India starts looking like. It's still a patchwork. There is no geographical contiguity of the British Empire. There are pieces of 565 semi-independent princely states scattered right across the Indian subcontinent. And when we come to the partition of India, this is what the map of India looks like. And across the western part of India, this is partition taking place with the broad line running across. This is the country now being partitioned. Pakistan, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan, today's Bangladesh, which were created in 1947. Administration under the British, especially under the Indian Civil Service, the ICS, or as they were sometimes called, the Heaven-born. At no point of time were there more than about 10,000 civil servants which ruled India. When we come close to India's independence, the figure drops down to roughly about 6,000, of which roughly about half are Indians and half are British nationals. The crucial subjects, law and order, were always with British officials. It was a highly capable, extremely efficient, and a very honest band of administrators. Right across India, from the peasants, they would be referred to my Baap. You are my father and my mother. You are the one who's going to sort everything out to me. And very often they did. They would go on these tours into remote areas, pass judgments that would change lives. But as I mentioned, it was a highly dedicated and a highly capable band of men. The other aspect which was there are the Indian princes, the more than colorful Indian princes at the time of India's independence, roughly about 565 of them. And many of them supplied soldiers to the Indian army, the British Indian Army, including during the Second World War, three major Indian states supplied soldiers, especially for the Mesopotamian campaign. And these were Hyderabad, Bikaner, and Jodhpur. And in the Haifa campaign, they were very prominent in that. And right across, moving across towards the northwest, very often it was the Indian soldier who did the actual fighting. These are soldiers of the First World War, Indian soldiers serving in Europe. Roughly about 70,000 Indian soldiers died during the First World War. And this is a very typical Indian scene of an elephant carrying fuel to be lowered to refuel an aircraft. The other thing which shaped India under the British was the building of the railways. Starting from 1851, where a short stretch of railway track between the city of Mumbai and a suburb called Thane was built. Between that point of time to the year 1900, roughly about 25,000 miles of railway track spanned the Indian subcontinent. It was different from the standard gauge of Britain, which is, I think, 4 feet, 8 3/4 of an inch. The Indian broad gauge was 5 feet, 6 inches. After the Great Uprising of 1857, no Indian prince was permitted to have a broad gauge railway line in his princely state. He could either have a meter gauge or a narrow gauge line. The reason was very simple, that in the event of a mutiny again, no Indian prince could lock his trains with his troops onto the grid of British India, while the British Indian troops could move swiftly across the country to take whatever action needed to be taken wherever. The Indian princes had an enormous role to play in propping up British presence in India. After the collapse of the Mughal Empire, several other smaller princes emerged, and many of them became extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. For example, when the state of Awadh, which was taken over after the great uprising of 1857, Oudh, as it was written earlier, Oudh, that was fragmented and was gifted to various smaller princes of the Punjab area who had helped the British suppress the great uprising of 1857. Now, the traditional relationship between an Indian prince and his subjects altered. In the traditional relationship, an Indian prince was really dependent on his subjects for his position, and it was almost like a contractual relationship which he had with his subjects. You keep me in power, I look after you. Now that equation altered because there was somebody above the Indian prince, the British rule, or which was normally enforced through what was called the resident, who would be stationed within every single major princely court across India. This is the Begum of Bhopal, one of the most progressive rulers of India at that point of time. This is a gathering of British ladies and the Viceroy's wife with the Begum of Bhopal. And this is one of the most flamboyant princes of India, Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala. And then there was the extremely physically strong Nizam of Hyderabad, Sir Mehboob Ali Khan, who was at one point of time the world's richest man. And the family fortune, unfortunately, was squandered away when one of his descendants moved to Australia and ran this immense family fortune to the ground by trying to run a sheep farm. One of the civil servants who served in India was Alan Octavian Hume, the grandson of the very wealthy and celebrated British politician Joseph Hume. He came to India and was posted as the collector of the Etawah district in northern India. This is the time of a great famine which was raging across India, the 1870s. A great darbar, a great gathering was being held by the Viceroy Lord Lytton to celebrate the crowning of and the designating Queen Victoria as the Empress of India. And income tax had also been imposed in India at the same time. Hume opposed both these measures, both the darbar and this great gathering and the enormous amount of money being spent while there was a famine on, and he also opposed income tax. Not unexpectedly, he was sort of relegated to the sidelines, and he finally resigned from the Indian civil service. Now, he was a man of hobbies who drove his hobbies long and hard. One of them was collecting, he built an immense ornithological collection. Much of his birds are still there. The collection is still there in the London Museum of Natural History. After that, he moved to this belief, if you will, called theosophy, and he was hugely influenced by this lady, Madame Blavatsky, and her protege, Colonel Olcott. Now, partly under their influence and partly through his own thinking, he decided to create an organization, the Indian National Congress, and to create a platform which would bring the British and the Indians as people closer together. Strangely enough, but not unsurprisingly, that is the organization that completely broke away from what Hume had planned and finally spearheaded India's national movement. This is the first session of the Congress in 1885. Now, at that point of time, all the Congress asked for is a greater say in governance. At no point of time is there talk of independence. At no point of time is there talk of even a dominion state. India doesn't want it. India is quite happy with the British being there. It's till in the Congress in 1909 at its annual session again says, we want a greater say in the governance of our own country. All that changes in 1919. After a massacre which took place at a place called the Jallianwala Bagh in the city of Amritsar, where an unarmed crowd was fired upon by this man, General Dyer. That completely changed everything. Now, India says complete independence. Much also has happened. A half promise of freedom has been given for India at the end of the First World War. That you help us in the First World War, you give us the money and the soldiers, don't oppose the war, and we'll sort of give you independence. That promise wasn't fulfilled. It's also the arrival of Gandhi on the scene by then. Gandhi is the first man, perhaps, in the world who was able to amass and direct public opinion in a particular direction. And in his case, non-violent moving towards the independence of India. This is an image of Lord Curzon, arguably the grandest viceroy of them all. Gandhi with Lord Mountbatten. Lord Mountbatten has left us with a very ambiguous legacy. We do not know much of what went on in that man's mind. There is a move to declassify some papers, which are still being held under classified as a classified document. They were to be declassified, but then the cabinet about 4 years ago ruled that they will not be declassified at the moment. I, for one, would be very curious to say what those papers contained. And this is now at the end, on August 15th, 1947, India gets independence, but remains a dominion. And Mountbatten becomes the first Governor General of independent India. And with him is Rajagopalachari, who becomes the second Governor General of independent India. This is a status which remains up to the enactment of India's constitution in 1952. And this is, of course, the lecture for freedom. And this is what was the star of India, and with the motto of the Raj, heaven's light, our guide.